desegregating Connecticut, but doesn't really feel like you have a lot of confidence in your understanding of zoning. We want to meet everyone where they are. And so we want to start with like, what is zoning? How does it work? And that's what Sarah is going to run us through. We're then going to talk about what are the big housing issues in the state right now? And more importantly, how can we respond in a way that promotes homes all across our state? This includes new ideas and older policies that we passed either last year or have promoted across the last year and a half of the organization's existence. Nick is going to introduce those. And then finally, I will be talking about how we can wield our own power in our own communities to make change. There's stuff that the organization is doing at the statewide level, and there's things that happen at Capitol Hill or in meetings, but there's so much more that can be done in our local communities, right down the block at our local city hall or town center or wherever you're coming from. And so our goal for this meeting today, our third one, is to really like talk about how we can be the change where we are. The one thing I will add, or I will ask you to ruminate on, and you'll see these purple boxes throughout this evening, things to consider. What are you hoping to get out of it? Out of this presentation? We will have folks throughout the presentation who can jump in the chat and answer questions if you have a short question, but if you have something a little more involved, that you feel like that I imagine we'll get to it. But if we don't at the end, there will be some time for Q&A. And so make sure that you keep that with you, that you write it down, whatever is necessary to make sure that you walk out of this event with a real feeling like you achieved your own personal goal here. And with that, I will turn it over to Sarah Bronin to discuss the basics of zoning.
Thank you so much, Will, for leading this event and for all bringing your expertise. And I'm really excited to hear questions and see what folks have to say. So I think it's my role today to put on my professor hat and turn to the basics of zoning, give you a quick 3-minute summary of that. Zoning is district-specific regulation of land uses, structures, and lots. So what does this mean? It means that zoning divides up a municipality into different districts, and each of those are regulated in different ways. So you could have industrial districts or commercial districts or mixed use districts, residential districts, open space districts. If you go to your town zoning code, there should be a list of all the districts, and that would indicate how that part of town is going to be regulated. The zoning code will also articulate how housing can be built, where it can be built, what type of housing, the number of units, and also what the housing looks like and where it can be located on a lot. So keeping that in mind, let's step back and ask, where did zoning come from? So zoning as a concept is really about 100 years old. So not as old as Connecticut. Here in Hartford, we're almost 400 years old. So 3/4 of our existence at least was without zoning. But it's the state that has adopted a zoning enabling act, and that gives towns the ability to zone. Here's the old copies of the 100-year-old national state zoning enabling act that every state has adopted. And again, it's states that hand their power to zone over to local governments. So if you look at an example of a local zoning code, we decided to put Stanford's up here, and you can see there's always a cover page, and then inside the zoning code, there's lots of words, sometimes charts. There's that list of districts on the right there that I mentioned is often included in zoning regulations. But these are just 2 pages of 465 pages in Stanford zoning code. Not all codes are that long. However, some codes are longer. So zoning codes vary across the state. And as you think about how your town zones, it's important to get a hold of that document and take a look and sift through it and see how understandable it is. So there are lots of reasons why people pass zoning in the first place and why we think it's time to change. We don't have enough time today to go through all of the reasons. all of us, I think, we're driven to act here from an equity perspective. We're driven to looking at the structural inequality that zoning creates. There are also economic reasons to undertake zoning reform, as well as environmental reasons, some of which we will talk about today, and some of the proposals that Nick is going to talk about. I think that one question for you to consider is, why are you here today? What made you decide to take this time out of your Tuesday night to be here? Is it because of zoning? I mean, is it because of equity? Is it because of economic concerns? Is it because of environmental concerns? All of these are valid. They're very intersectional. And we also want you to think about that, because that's really where your passion comes from. So from any of these perspectives, you can be a really powerful advocate for zoning reform, because you can use your voice and your passion to make change. So with that, I'm going to turn it over back over to Will, who's going to talk about how you can learn more about how your town zones.
Thank you, Sarah. And the thing that I want to flag for this next section that Sarah mentioned in that, beyond the like roots of zoning, is the thing that always stands out to me, which is that Stanford's zoning code is 465 pages. And on top of that, it's not just the text. There's 465 pages and also this map. To really start to understand how zoning actually works in space, on ground, in people's lives, you have to take all of those 460 pages and apply them to this map, and then also consider every single subhead and small like footnote. There's so much there. And so as I'm thinking as a local advocate and organizer, how do I organize people around this? It's incredibly complicated to communicate, or it was until last year when we introduced the Connecticut Zoning Atlas. This was a collaboration between DESEGREGATE CT and the CT Data Collaborative with immense amount of volunteer effort and work. And this, I will say, is the single, as an organizer and a local advocate, your most valuable tool for understanding how your local zoning works, what it limits, and what it does. We have the URL up there at the top. When we're done with this event, I'd highly recommend that you just play around with it. I spent a couple hours yesterday clicking around and learning things about different towns I didn't know about. It was fascinating. But the big value that our zoning atlas offers for a land use advocate and an organizer is an understanding of, very simply and clearly, in your town, what is allowed to go where. So you can use the options on the left here to select, say, single family housing. We're not restricting as of right, or only after a public hearing. And those are sort of detailed things that we can go into later if folks are interested. And there's a lot of information on the website. We're just saying what in the state is zoned for single family housing. And what we can see is that 91% of all land in Connecticut is zoned for single family housing. This is not true for almost any other kind of housing. We are a state that is zoned almost entirely with one size fits all regulation. And so when you dive in onto any of these towns, as we can right here, we're looking at Wallingford, Connecticut, with a nice train station in the middle. You see on the right here, we have single family housing zoning as of right in Wallingford. Anywhere there's purple, you can build a single family house as of right. On the left is 4-family housing. And we notice not even near the train station in Wallingford, not to pick on Wallingford, there are lots of towns that are struggling with existing zoning. Wallingford is just an interesting example that I found yesterday. Very, very small parts of Wallingford are you able to build a house that could house 4 families as of right. And this is for many reasons and things that Nick will talk about later. This is not only exclusionary and hurts our state's efforts for equity, but it also hurts our local and state economic development, and it hurts our environment. And so you can very easily with the zoning atlas jump right into your own town and see what are all of the things what are all the regulations that your zoning code restricts or allows in your own town. It can tell you, does your town zone primarily for single family homes? Now you'll see on the left here, this is what you would see to the left of the map on desegregatect.org/atlas. You'd click that, check that one family zoning box. You'll see everywhere that it's single family housing. Where does it allow accessory apartments or accessory dwelling units on the zoning atlas? And you can see, does your town allow accessory apartments? Is that allowed everywhere? Some places, maybe are you allowed to do it by right, or do you need a special permit? Do you zone for multifamily housing around shops, around any sort of public transit? We know that these walkable mixed use neighborhoods are good for the environment, for our health, for equity, for economic growth. And we saw just in the example with Wallingford that within a half mile of the train station, you can't really build 4+ family housing as of right. And finally, we have quite a fair amount of minimal lot size options to look at. How big does the lot have to be to build a house in your town? This is something that, again, Nick will speak on a little bit and talk about the impact that has for policy and for what we can build. I will just leave it here before I turn it over to Nick with this tool for a local organizer. And when we talk a little bit about advocacy strategy and organizing strategy a little later, this tool, it can be your best friend and is immensely powerful. It is, I should note, the only one of its kind in the country. And so it's just a monumentally helpful tool. As we go now into particularly the problems that Connecticut faces and some of the solutions, I want you to think about what are the things that you would want to know about your town. I can say I'm zooming in from New Haven, Connecticut right now. The sorts of zoning restrictions that we have are very different than the sorts of zoning restrictions in Wallingford or in Brooklyn or in Stamford even. And so think about where you are and the questions or problems that you think about, that you care about. What would you want to know about your town, and how might the zoning atlas help you fill in that information? And with that, I will turn it over to Nick Abbott, and he will tell us all about some common housing issues and what sort of policy responses we should have.
Thanks, Will. So diving in, a lot of people on this call and working with our coalition partners over the course of the past year and a half, we have a sense of what the problem is, and the zoning atlas helps to enlighten what that problem is. In particular, one size fits all zoning, limiting us to only building single family homes, large minimum lot sizes. But what we're particularly interested in is figuring out, now that we know what the problem is, how do we figure out what the best solution is? And how do we develop solutions that we can actually get past through the state legislature and at the local level to make the greatest impact on the shared equity, economic, and environmental goals we all care about? So the first thing that we know based on the data is, as Will talked about, is that the zoning atlas shows that 91% of land is zoned for single family housing. Now, some of this land allows for other types of housing, but we know that over 90% allows for single family housing. And that we need more diverse options than just single family housing. We need all sorts of different housing types. Now, in some places, sometimes it might mean large apartment buildings and large multifamily buildings, which we need a lot more of. But in between a large multifamily building and a single family home, towns oftentimes do not allow, but should be allowing, a lot more of diverse housing types. Those can be duplexes, townhomes, cottage clusters, and a range of other housing options that can be more environmentally sustainable and provide a more affordable option to people who can't afford a single family home on a large lot. One strategy that we have and that we know has worked in other states to help chip away at single family exclusive zoning is to allow for accessory apartments, otherwise known as accessory dwelling units, or ADUs in some other states. The zoning atlas, what we found in doing research was that a lot of towns in Connecticut allowed for these accessory apartments in some form or another, but too often these regulations do not actually allow them to be built in practice. In my hometown of Greenwich, for example, accessory apartments have been allowed for over 30 years, but fewer than 100 have been built. What we know is that there's still a huge demand actually for these. And so we were wondering, why isn't anybody building them? And we know that by lifting arbitrary regulations, lifting special permitting requirements, lifting arbitrary size requirements, or banning renters, or all a litany of other requirements that depressed and prevented people from actually building them, by developing, in fact, a uniform standard that applies across the state, we can actually help to make it so that towns will actually allow them and people actually will build these accessory apartments. So what the stage that we're at now is, following the passage of HB 6107 last spring, is that all towns are required by the state to allow for accessory apartments free of particularly burdensome regulations. The state law does have a provision that allows towns to opt out of this requirement, which means that by a 2/3 vote of the Planning and Zoning Commission and of the local legislative body, whether that's a representative town meeting or a town council or a city council, if 2/3 of each of those bodies separately vote to opt out, towns can be free of their obligation under state law. We've been monitoring these developments really closely and working with some of you on this call to prevent towns from doing this, hopefully via education, but also by showing that there's a huge amount of demand for accessory apartments, and that by proactively adopting regulations in line with state law, or at the very least, not opting out of state law, towns can make a smart planning decision to allow for this great sort of housing type that doesn't fundamentally alter the architectural character of the neighborhood in which it sits. If you're interested in more information, particularly for how you can leverage accessory apartments, the ADU site on our website, linked here, includes some helpful information about accessory apartments generally. And we've also been putting together, as you'll see on the right-hand side, town-specific one-pagers that show not just what the benefits are, but what towns currently allow based on data from our zoning atlas. If you're interested in getting one of these one-pagers for your town, don't hesitate to reach out to us, and we'd be happy to produce one or share one we've already produced with you that can help stress the benefits that accessory apartments offer for your particular town. Another particular issue that we've been focusing on, and actually that we'll be having an event on Thursday on and releasing a big report on tomorrow, is around allowing more housing near transit. You'll see this map shows the 40 transit towns in Connecticut that have either a railroad station or a fast track bus station. And that covers 62 stations. Our state invests a lot in our public transit infrastructure. It's one of our greatest resources. And particularly with a huge influx of federal money coming into our state, we're going to continue to invest in those resources. Unfortunately, we won't be making the most of our transit if we aren't allowing people to live near transit and to make the most of it so we can actually fully utilize our train and bus lines. What we found through the zoning atlas, and as you'll see if you stay tuned to your inboxes and watch for our report release tomorrow, is that a lot of transit towns prohibit multifamily housing altogether near transit stations or in a majority of the area surrounding their station. By requiring municipalities and working with municipalities, and hopefully by working with local activists and advocates in each town across the state to advocate for transit-oriented communities and for allowing more housing near transit, we're hoping that we can actually change that conversation so that we can build more housing near transit and people can make the most of this sustainable mode of transportation. And yeah, as you see there, we'll be releasing that report tomorrow, so I hope you're on the edge of your seats for that. Meriden provides a pretty good example, using some data again from the zoning atlas, of a town that does allow multifamily housing near transit. Unfortunately, what you see here is that by allowing more housing there, people can walk to the train station. We don't need to have huge parking lots near our train stations. We know that at least increased ridership decreases suburban sprawl, and has a host of economic, environmental, and equity benefits. We want a lot more towns in Connecticut to be like Meriden and to follow that model, which is to allow for medium and high density housing near those stations. And once again, I highlighted our accessory apartment one-pagers. We have some similar one-pagers we've put together with some helpful graphics and information about transit-oriented communities, which is our term for referring to mixes of uses and more housing near transit. And we've put together one-pagers, which are uploaded to our site, so you don't even need to request them, for every transit town in Connecticut. So if your town has a fast track station or a train station, you can go to this link and you can access a town-specific one-pager showing where multifamily housing is allowed near your transit station and what we think could be done to help improve things in your town. The last thing I'm going to talk about is minimum lot sizes. And this is something that we've been paying increasing attention to in the course of our research, particularly as we learned a lot more about them through our zoning atlas. What we found was that 81% of residential land requires at least 1 acre for a minimum lot size. That's a pretty astounding stat, which shows that what that means is that if you can't afford at least an acre of land, then you're going to be priced out of the vast majority of land in our state. We know that particularly high minimum lot sizes are likely to price people out of certain areas, but also lead to sprawl. If we can't subdivide lots and build a number of smaller homes closer together, we know that we're going to push people further away from jobs and community centers and services, and going to be much more spread out, not just hurting, pushing people in their cars for longer, but erasing any chance at having walkable neighborhoods. Something I was thinking about, with Halloween last week was, how do we promote the sorts of walkable neighborhoods where we form community and where we're all together? And shrinking or eliminating minimum lot sizes altogether is one important way we can get there, in addition to adding more multifamily housing. So if you go to our lots page, you'll see a lot more information about that. But for now, I will turn it back over. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Nick. So we've now come through about a half an hour of us telling everyone here, particularly Nick, telling us all the terrible things that are happening in zoning in our state, or in much of our state, and some really good, smart ways to fix it. The question then, and it's sort of the question every time, is how do we actually do this? How do we make change? Because a lot of the time with zoning, it feels like it's some small group of people in some room somewhere just writing these things, or that they've been handed down through history, and that the inertia of history is too much to ever change these things. What I will say is neither of those things are true. And in fact, zoning is one of the things you have the most power to change, because at the moment, so much of it is done at the local and state level. And that as we can change things at the local level or change things at the state level, those are things that, like, you right now, a sort of normal, ordinary person, have the power to change in your community. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to, before we get to this, I will say this presentation and future presentations are based off these playbooks that the organization DESEGREGATE CT has put together around our whole effort to build power and build momentum around making local and state change. That this is something we can do and that you can do yourself. Right now, we're talking about for land use advocates, and you see the playbook on the right is targeted at land use advocates. We're hoping that this presentation is more a supplement and a complement to that than regurgitation. So you will hear lots of things tonight that you will not see in the playbook, and you will see lots of interesting stuff in the playbook that you will not see tonight. Similarly, we have playbooks for land use commissioners and for land use board candidates. And we will be having, as Kevin will mention briefly later, we'll be holding another event just like this for land use commissioners later in the month to talk about, for each of these different roles, for people who are running or already in office, or just want to see change from their own non-official position. How can we make change in our own communities? As an advocate, I'm going to give you 4 framework tools to work with here to start to organize your community. Now, there's so much on organizing, on how to do it well, how to do it for politics versus community organizing, how to build bridges, how to do public events. There's so much. And some of that information is actually in our Be the Change Advocacy playbook. But what I want to offer tonight is a framework that will apply for any local community power building you will ever do. But place it in the context of the zoning changes that we need to see right now. The four big tenets that I'm going to hit over and over and over again, because I cannot emphasize how important these are to, one, set a goal, and we will talk about what that goal needs to look like soon. To map power in your community and to understand how power flows and interacts. To choose your strategy, and then to make a plan. We'll now run into what those actually mean. When I'm talking about setting a goal, there are three really important pieces to that goal. That goal needs to be concrete, that goal needs to be measurable, and that goal needs to be attainable. I am going to use accessory dwelling units as an example because I think it does a lot of good work for explaining sort of how we take these ideas of concrete, measurable, and attainable and put them into practice. When I say concrete, this needs to be a goal that is tangible. Our organization is called Desegregate Connecticut, and desegregating Connecticut is an important part of our mission. But that desegregating Connecticut cannot be a goal that you organize around because it's not concrete, it's not rooted in the sort of the tangential laws, the tangible laws and regulations that govern our day-to-day. Those laws and regulations have shaped why our state is so segregated. But when we think about a goal for organizing, it needs to be something as concrete as, I want to make accessory dwelling units allowed as of right and not only just after a public hearing. Now, it can feel sometimes like to get a goal that concrete, you really need to be deep in the policy weeds. And what I'll say is that's not at all true, because there's so much support offered into figuring out what your goal should be. Whether that's looking at the zoning atlas or looking at all of the resources on Desegregate CT's website, whether that's reaching out to a member of the organization to say, hey, this is the thing I'm really worried about. What sort of concrete goals should I try to change in my community? Or that's conversations with a neighbor, a friend who is really struggling trying to find housing or really wants to build an accessory dwelling unit and can't. You need to set a concrete goal in order to organize around it, because that's the sort of thing that you can hang a hat on and say, this is what we're trying to do. And that everything else I'm going to talk about in this organizing training comes from. It also needs to be measurable. This is a little more obvious. Doesn't need to be quantitative. It can be as simple as yes or no, but you need to be able to say that you've achieved it or that you haven't achieved it. And that's hard because when you're an organizer, you want to see everything as a victory. But the ability to measure and evaluate how you're doing and whether you've been successful is incredibly, incredibly important, as we will talk about a little bit later. You need to be able to say, yes, we passed a law that now non-owners can live in accessory dwelling units. Or now you can build accessory dwelling units as of right. And that yes or no binary allows you to measure. Attainability is the third piece of setting a goal. And it's hard because there are a lot of organizers who say that settling for something attainable limits your imagination. And what I will say is your goal needs to be attainable for whatever time frame you're operating on. You may think that you may be operating on a 50-year organizing timeline. You may be operating on a 1-year operating timeline. But if I came to you and I said, my organizing goal is to make New Haven as dense as Manhattan within 1 year, that's concrete and it's measurable. It's not attainable, and you will never get behind that, regardless of whether you agree. Because it's really like it's not something that is attainable in the time frame. And that attainability is how we get into, we'll get to that in a second. As we're going through this, I'd love you to start to think about what your goals for your own organizing might be. What are the things in your town that you'd love to see? And how can you turn it into something that is concrete, that is measurable, and that is attainable? So rather than just more housing, what might that look like? Is that making ADUs legal? Is that making duplexes legal and having not your whole town limited to single family? Is that limiting lot sizes? There's lots of options. Or is that one of the statewide policy options that Desegregate CT is beginning to look at? Now that we're talking about attainability, you need to start to think about who can shape these goals. So let's start with ADUs again. In some communities, the people who legalize ADUs are planning and zoning commissions. In some, it's town councils. I can say here in New Haven, the Board of Alders had to pass legislation to legalize ADUs. And notably, the state and the state legislature and the governor can do this. They did last year in the passing of Public Act 2129. When you're organizing, once you have your goal set, your concrete, measurable, attainable goal, you need to know who has the power to affect that. So as you're thinking about the goal that you set just now, who has the power to shape that? You may be friends with a local official. That makes your life really easy, because if you're friends with a local elected official, the set of options for persuading that person is much broader than someone you don't know. You could invite them to coffee. But maybe that coffee doesn't go so well. This person also has constituents, people who vote for them, and has to run for election every 2 years or 4 years, depending on your town or the office. Mapping power like this is incredibly important because of what it allows you to do for seeing what are all of the different strategies you could take to approach your goal. Again, all of this comes back to your goal. You have a goal that's concrete, that's measurable, that's attainable. Who can affect that? And before you start to do any of the strategic work, you need to understand all of the power structures at play in your town or in the state, who can shape these things, and what are all of the pressure points that you as an advocate and an organizer can push on to encourage the people who can affect your goals to do so. Once you've done that power mapping, and only once you've done that power mapping, and I cannot emphasize how important it is that you do the power mapping before you choose your strategy. You choose your strategy. Here we have the members of the Wallingford Planning and Zoning Commission and the recently elected members of the Wallingford Town Council. Once you have, so to go into Wallingford for a second, for zoning changes in Wallingford, Connecticut, the Planning and Zoning Commission is the body that makes zoning changes, but the Town Council appoints and confirms members to the Planning and Zoning Commission. This means that once I've mapped power and I understand all the power relationships here, I have many different strategies available to me. Maybe I'm good friends with a member of the Planning and Zoning Commission. Again, I grab them for coffee, and over 2 months, I'm able to meet with my good friend and then their friends and colleagues on the commission and persuade them, you know what, these are great ideas. If I can do that, I don't need to organize 50 people for a rally outside of town hall. I can impact the people with power through a much easier, simpler, and less confrontational manner. That said, maybe the members of the Planning and Zoning Commission aren't interested. Well, I know the town council and I know what it takes to be elected to town council, just about 6,000 votes. Maybe I think I can get 6,000 votes for town council. Maybe I think I can get 5 other people to run and get 6,000 votes for town council. It's only once you have a sense of the power relationships and the map of power in your community, and then again, we're working backwards to the goal. How can I impact the people who have the ability to affect the goal that I chose at the top? We're always coming back to the goal. It's only once we have the goal that's measurable, attainable, and concrete, and only once I understand all of the power relationships, only then do I start to think about how am I going to impact them? And this is where I start to consider my own tools. I know that DESEGREGATE CT has a bunch of resources available. Maybe I'll go there, see if they have any suggestions for what I can do. Maybe I'll reach out to someone. Maybe I have a good friend who worked on a political campaign once, and I'll reach out to them. Maybe I'm already in a group of 20 people who are involved in local politics, and I can persuade them to get involved. There's an immense number of strategic choices available to you. but it's often very easy to get lost in the weeds of strategy here. And it always, always, always needs to come back to what was my goal, who can affect it, and how can I impact those people? Finally, I've chosen a goal. I've decided that I am going to meet for coffee with every member of the Wallingford Planning and Zoning Commission and push for them to allow accessory apartments by right without owner occupancy. This is a concrete, measurable, attainable goal. I know I've mapped the power, and I know that I'm good friends with several of the members of the commission. And then I've chosen my strategy. Once I've done that, I can make a plan. The 3 questions in make a plan here are just as important as everything that comes before. Once I have my plan, I'm going to get coffee with the 5 members of the Wallingford Planning and Zoning Commission. Maybe I'll also get to the 3 alternates if I get time. I'm going to persuade them that this is the right idea. I know what I'm going to do. When I'm going to do it, I'm going to do 1 coffee a week. How will I know it's working? And this is where every organizing effort ever gets caught up. Every time. Because the frequency that you get everything that you want the first time you try it is next to nothing, next to 0. Which is why making this plan is so important. You need to know, all right, I have my concrete, attainable, measurable goal. I've mapped power, and I know what strategy is going to get me to persuade the folks who have power. Then I'm going to write down what I'm going to do. I'm going to write down when I'm going to do it. And I'm going to need to make sure that I'm constantly evaluating whether it's working. It's very easy to get excited about a strategy, to run at it, and then to hit a wall because it's not really working, and then get stuck or stop, or run right through that wall and never even consider the possibility that it's not working. But if I'm trying to get ADUs to allow non-owner occupancy by right in Wallingford, Connecticut, and I'm going to do that through coffees with these 8 members of the Wallingford Planning and Zoning Commission, what I need to do then is, if I have 3 coffees and none of them come away persuaded, it's not working. And this strategy is not getting me to my goal. At which point I need to reevaluate, because ultimately we're trying to achieve a goal, and the more time I spend on things that aren't working, the less likely it is that the goal is going to be achieved. Maybe I'm going to alienate people in my community. Maybe I'm just going to become sort of a crank who's constantly shouting at people about the need to zone for ADUs by right. Or maybe I'm going to get discouraged and say, I tried my best and it didn't happen. We need to constantly consider the possibility of failure. And I don't say that as someone to discourage folks on this call, because as long as we maintain that possibility, we can understand the failure isn't the goal. The goal isn't impossible. We already decided it's attainable at the top. The failure is the strategy. And if the failure is the strategy, then if we've mapped power, there's so many different strategies we can take. It's incredibly important that on top of having a concrete, measurable, and attainable goal, on top of mapping power in your community, mapping relationships, on top of choosing the strategy that I'm going to use, that I am constantly evaluating, is it working? And is it working on the timeline I set? Is the plan right? Because if the plan isn't right, I need to go back. And that's fine. I can tell you in my own career, I've hit many road bumps. I've been working in campaigns for several years, and I've lost many of them. It's hard, and it's hard to make change, but it's doable as long as we keep an eye on the goal, the relationships, the strategy, and the plan. Now, those are like big capital letters, here's how to organize your community. And this is not, you are not like, what I'm hoping is that you came away with those 4 things, and you're going to remember them whenever you think about any organizing work in the future. Now, whether you're going to go to a public meeting tomorrow, or whether this is something that you're going to do in 2 years, I want you to keep those constant. But there's a lot of little tactical stuff that goes into organizing as well. And this is where Desegregate CT, again, has incredible resources available. We have a page just on advice for op-eds and writing letters to the editor. Kevin, who you've already met, who's on this call, helped run our op-ed and letter to the editor program last year, and got letters to the editor and op-eds published in pretty much every major publication in the state. We were all over the place. That's a way that you can fill op-eds or letter to the editors into your bigger organizing effort locally. Or you can speak at public meetings. The Wallingford Planning and Zoning Commission has meetings. I don't mean to keep picking on Wallingford. I love Wallingford. They're just there in my head now. But the Wallingford Planning and Zoning Commission has public meetings, and you can simply speak in the public comment period. And our website, again, has really, really helpful tools for how to make your voice heard, how to persuade people, how to respond to common myths. There's so much you can do. I will also say here that the Be the Change Advocate playbook that we've mentioned many, many times, that this event is based on, has a lot more tactical stuff in it on top of these big 4. Things about how to take these big 4 ideas and actually apply them in your community. And I will also say, before I turn this over, as we slowly march towards the end of this event, we in the organization are also a constant resource. If you have questions, you can get to me, you can get to Nick, you can get to Kevin. There's dozens of people who are working in the organization towards these ends. And so we are also a resource. Do not feel like this training, which I hope has been helpful, is the end of all of the help we can offer. We want this to be the beginning of a beautiful relationship and a long, long effort to shape the future of the state. And now I'll turn it over to Kevin.
Hey, Will, thank you so much. I think that there are some other questions in the chat. There's one question about the difference between strategy and advocacy. So could you address that before I head on to what's next?
Yes, I'm looking in the chat now. Sorry, everyone. What was the question? The strategy and the difference between strategy and the plan, from Pat? Great question, Pat. The difference between strategy and the plan is that the strategy is the sort of way that you are going to apply pressure, the strategic choice you are going to use to apply pressure through the power map. The plan is specifically what you're going to do. So say that I'm going to persuade folks on the Planning and Zoning Commission. The plan is I'm going to get coffee with one of them. I'm going to do that every week. So it's not only what you're going to do, but it's when you're going to do it. And then finally, third, how are you going to know it's working or not working? And what are going to be your standards for reevaluation, for saying, all right, this strategy isn't working, go back to the power mapping stage. The plan is essentially writing everything down and building out a timeline for yourself, as opposed to strategy is, here's the big picture, how I'm going to apply pressure that speaks to the power map. Did that answer your question? You can answer in the chat. If it didn't, feel free, I'll respond, or we'll talk in the Q&A section right after this.
Awesome. All right. If you guys have any other questions for Will, we're going to have a Q&A section. But for now, I want to talk about some tangible action items you can take, is what Will's already provided, about how you can be the change in your own community. So first, we have 2 events that we've already briefly touched on November 11th. This Thursday, I believe, we're going to be revealing our research on transit-oriented communities. We're basically going to be talking about how we found that we don't have enough housing and development around our transit centers, which is a huge problem. We're going to be talking a bit more about why that is a problem in that meeting, and I hope that you can show up. We're also going to be talking about our research on minimum lot sizes, how that impacts housing development. We're going to have a guest from the Trust for Public Land, an environmental group who we partnered with in the past before, and we're really excited to have these events. You know, the real key thing is, and you can attend our events at www.desegregatect.org/events. The real key here is, if we don't understand what's wrong with our restrictive zoning laws, we're never going to be able to do what's right to fix them. And, you know, this is something that's really undergirded the work that we've done. And we really hope you show up to these events and others that we, in fact, put on in the future. As Nick and Will mentioned earlier, we also have a Be the Change workshop for pro homes commissioners, talking about how if they sit on land use local boards and commissions, they can make decisions that help advance the goals of our statewide zoning regulations at the local level and help build momentum for further goals that we can undertake. You know, I've already sent a registration link to a lot of the local commissioners in Simsbury, where I'm from, and I think they're planning on attending. So I strongly advise you guys to do the same. We really think that a lot of this change is going to come from the grassroots, from our local communities, and we want our land use commissioners to be a vital part of this too. So one real key thing that we want you guys to do is, if you're interested in serving as a local leader at the grassroots level in your community, helping advance our cause, please go to desegregatect.org/volunteer. We're looking to identify local leaders and local activists who can help push work in their communities. If you want to take that step, if you want to get involved in this movement, we strongly encourage you to go to that link and put your name, your contact info, what town you're from, how much you're willing to get involved. We're thinking the leadership time commitment is probably not going to be more than 2 hours a week. And the fact that you are here and that you are ready, to get involved in your community suggests that we really want to partner with you. I can talk a bit about my experience organizing in my hometown in Simsbury. There's an opt-out vote on the ADU provisions of the bill that's happening on Monday. And over the past couple of weeks, I've been organizing, talking with friends, neighbors, community members, and working with them to get public comments submitted to our zoning commissioners to speak about the importance of ADUs on so many different levels. And it is so crucial that at the local level, especially in towns like Simsbury, we organize to preserve our legislative gains from last session, as well as build political momentum to advance further gains in the next session and more. So if you're interested in doing work like that or other types of work, please get involved with us, and we really need you in this fight with us. We cannot afford complacency, as we've already mentioned today, not at the state level and certainly not at the local level. And it's not just enough, as to hope that things get better. We have to play an active part in being the change in our local communities. And we're so happy you took the first step in showing up today. We hope that you continue to take further steps in your community. We're willing to help you do that and more.
Great. And Kevin, there's some questions in the chat that I think we should probably address. So, folks, feel free to keep them going. It looks like Kate has a question about what are some reasons for pushback on some of these changes. Ev had a question as well. Maybe I'll take Kate's question just since we only have a couple minutes left, and just say, during the last session of the legislature, we did hear some pushback on a couple of issues, and actually I'm going to put in the chat our FAQs page, which addresses some of the things that we heard. For example, things like, what will happen to my local zoning, and shouldn't this be an exclusively local issue? Other what we might call myths about the impact of zoning reform, things like zoning reform will bring more crime or overcrowd our schools. And on that page, the FAQs, we address each of these types of criticisms of zoning reform with research and information about the particular issue. For schools, for example, we show how Connecticut's school population is declining. The buildings are there, the infrastructure is there, the personnel is there. So the idea that crowding schools is a threat is really sort of beyond, maybe misses the point in the facts of what is today. And also, we provide information showing that multifamily housing doesn't actually lead to school overcrowding because it's usually fewer kids per unit than single family housing. I just use that as one example to say there's been a few arguments. We try to address those in the FAQs, and it might be helpful for you to look at those if you're hearing certain ones in your town. Ev, you also have a question about the infrastructure bill. The governor just put a press release out, and I'll link to it here, that talks a little bit about where they think that the federal infrastructure bill might go, the cost might go. 1.3 billion of it will go to public transit. There's a lot on aging bridges and transportation and mostly roads, but there's other items too. So I encourage you to check that out. There's not a lot there, at least as far as I can tell, on sewer. There is some language about water that's in the federal bill, but when we see $1 billion for culvert grants in this bill, but again, we don't see much about sewer in that legislation. We do agree with you, though, that investments in that infrastructure could really help promote housing. I don't know if there are other questions, but I just wanted to dash those off really quickly before we come to the end of our time.
I'll just close by saying thank you all so much for joining us. DESEGREGATECT.org/volunteer is still on the screen. And we absolutely need folks to help us build this power over time. Kate, that's a great question. It depends on the town. Some of them we're already working with folks. Some of them you might be the first, and some of them, a lot of the time, I will just say, in my own experience, a lot of time I've assumed someone else is doing something, or that there might be something else doing, and so I'm not going to. And then no one is, and then nothing ever happens. So Kate, if you want to let us know or follow up in an email, I can put our email in the chat. And you shoot me a quick note about where you're coming from. And if you're interested, volunteer@desegregatect.org goes right through to the exact same place that desegregatect.org/volunteer does. And I'd love to follow up with you in a conversation about what that looked like in Shelton. If you don't have any more questions, thank you very much. This is the conclusion of the program. For anyone who does, feel free to send us an email, stay on here and put it in the chat. But otherwise, we will see you all very soon, and we look forward to working with you over the next 2 months, 5 years, 50 years to make Connecticut as great as it can be.